So welcome everyone that's joining us online. We're doing this program online and in person here at Homewood City Schools. I'm Carissa Anthony. I'm the Prevention and Development Coordinator. So I work with all of the schools in this district, but also with the community through the Safe and Healthy Homewood Collaborative. And we are very fortunate today to have a guest speaker, Dr. Halsey Maddox. She is double board certified in pediatrics and in sleep medicine. She's a sleep specialist. And I just recently learned that she is only one of 250 people who are double boarded in this particular topic. I have personally heard her speak several years ago, and then Lindsay Mullins that works for me also heard her speak back in February. And we knew then that this was a topic we wanted to bring to our families. We wanted them to learn how important this is. And after talking to Dr. Maddox, I do think maybe we need to get her in front of some students as well. I think they need to hear it straight from the expert. But anyway, without any more talking from me, I'm going to let Dr. Maddox take the floor.
Hey y'all, thanks so much for having me, and thanks to Homewood for this. I love everything sleep and I love sharing it, so I'm really honored to be here. So we're going to go through a lot of sleep information today. I wanted to encompass preschool all the way up to seniors in high school because I really want everyone to be included because sleep's important for everyone. So we're going to go through an outline today. So we've got 5 main topics. The first is how much sleep does my kiddo need? And it changes as they get older. Number 2, why the heck does sleep even matter? Also pretty important. Can I even help my child sleep better? I think I hear a lot of parents that throw their hands in the air and say, I don't even know what to do. What's a typical sleep problem? I think some people don't even recognize sleep issues as problems, and they can get a little help. How can we help? So let's talk through some of these things. So when we talk about how much sleep a child needs, well, Ernest Hemingway says, I love sleep. My life has the tendency to fall apart when I'm awake, And I would second that. I love sleep. I've always loved sleep. But let's talk about your kids' sleep. When they are in preschool, ages sort of 3 to 5, they need 10 to 13 hours of sleep in a 24-hour period. Now that can be broken up into a nap and then sleep at night, but they do need about 10 to 13 hours of sleep. And I want you to think about this in terms of a bell curve. All of sleep is a bell curve. So just like grades can be a bell curve, in school, sleep is a bell curve. So these are going to be ranges. Interestingly, preschool children are physically unable to sleep late. So I hear a lot of parents say, I put my child down at 11 o'clock last night and they still woke up at 6 a.m. That is totally normal. Their little bodies are set to wake up in the mornings. They are morning larks, almost always. When we think about elementary sleep, so kindergarten up through 5th or 6th grade, these children need 9 to 11 hours of sleep. And it's actually really abnormal for children to nap at this age. So if you've got a child who's napping in elementary school, we want you to reach out to your doctor. We do know that children rarely sleep in, no matter how late they're up, and they should wake up without an alarm at this age. When we think about the adolescents, and this slide probably dates me, but when we think about adolescents, we actually think about ages 12 to 24. So the brain really doesn't finish developing until people are about 25, sometimes 26. For our adolescents, the goal is 9 hours of sleep. This is when we often see naps make a resurgence. This is in part because children are really struggling because they're not getting enough sleep at night. And so they come home from school and fall sound asleep. The circadian rhythm shifts in adolescent sleep, and that's an important thing to note, and we'll talk a little more about that. But sleep patterns shift. So physiologically, as children start to go through puberty and that they're in puberty, they actually can't fall asleep before about 11 p.m., and they have a great deal of difficulty being awake before 8:30 a.m. But why does it matter, right? Well, Napoleon says, let her sleep, for when she wakes, she will shake the world. And there's a lot of truth to this statement. We know that we sleep for a third of our lives. It really better be important, right? So let's talk about it. Why does it matter? Well, in terms of preschool, it really matters for development. Children, their executive function, which is like their decision making and how they're trying to figure out the world, it all depends on sleep. Without sleep, even preschoolers really have trouble putting the pieces together. Even preschoolers, it impacts their mood. It impacts if they're crying more. It impacts if their feelings get hurt more. It impacts the ability to learn to share, things like that. And then their physical health. So preschoolers who don't sleep enough often can have trouble with growth, which is really significant. We only grow when we're asleep. They can also have trouble with more infections, like ear infections and runny noses. So sleep is really, really important for development in preschool. But what does that really mean? Well, it means that it makes preschoolers less impulsive, happier, less anxious, healthier, and more active. But what about elementary school? Does sleep really matter once they get to elementary school? Well, what we know is we know that sleep deprivation mimics ADHD. Oftentimes children get diagnosed with ADHD, but then we look at their sleep and we say, wait, you're not getting enough sleep. And these children, really and truly, you fix their sleep and their attention and their hyperactivity gets better. Lack of sleep has an almost paradoxical response in children in elementary school, where if they don't get enough sleep, sometimes they become more hyperactive. It also impacts their emotional regulation. This is across the board. So they're going to be more emotional to corrections in elementary school. They're going to be more emotional to playground, sort of tiffs. So it's really important to emotionally regulate them. It impacts their learning, their cognition, and it impacts their nutrition. In other words, sleep really impacts elementary school children, right? And so we talked a little bit about the emotional, the social, the academic, the cognitive, which is a little different from academics. So it's more of the really learning and processing and not just the learning academic skills, but also being able to use those academic skills in the real world. And then nutrition. And what about adolescence, right? We all think about the teenage brain, and all of us have seen the scene in Ferris Bueller where the teenagers are drooling on their desk because they're sound asleep. Well, we know that in children who don't get enough sleep, in terms of academics, their grades are less, they're more likely to miss school and have truancy issues, and their memory is not as good for learning. In terms of their health, we know that children who don't get enough sleep tend to either be overweight or have a higher incidence of eating disorders. They tend to be more ill. We know that not enough sleep actually can impact your white blood cell count, which those are your infection fighting cells. And it actually can lead to high blood pressure. In terms of safety, this is a big one. We often think about adolescents as being invincible, or at least they think they're invincible. But what we know is in adolescence, injuries are huge if they aren't getting enough sleep. So if you just take children really ages 8 to 16, there have been studies that show that if they're sleeping 7 hours or less a night, they're twice as likely to have an accidental injury where they fall off a curb and break their arm, for example. And it also happens in sports. So we know that children in high school who sleep less than 7 hours a night are twice as likely to have an injury that pulls them out of sports permanently. They're far more likely to get into motor vehicle accidents or motor vehicle crashes. If they're not getting enough sleep, actually the incidence of fighting goes up in the children who are sleep deprived. In terms of sports, who doesn't love sports in Alabama, right? But we know that sleep impacts reaction time, it impacts speed, it impacts accuracy. And if we look at some of those studies, we'll see them as we go forward, but it impacts everything from how accurate your serve is in tennis, to how fast your sprint time is, to how consistent you are with your free throws and three-pointers in basketball. And finally, behavior. You guys have probably heard that we have an epidemic of mood disorders in the country, whether it is anxiety or depression or attention problems. We know that not enough sleep makes anxiety worse. It makes depression worse. It, like we said, makes attention problems worse. It actually makes impulsivity worse. So children are far more likely to sort of impulsively make bad decisions. And it's really important for sleep, for behavior, that these children sleep, these adolescents sleep. So can I even help my child sleep better? Well, as Scott Fitzgerald said, the worst thing in the world is to try to sleep and not to. And I think all of us have probably been there at some point. Insomnia is horrible. It's even more horrible if your child wants to go to sleep and they can't, or if you see they need sleep and they can't. So what can we do? Well, everyone can utilize these strategies. And you're going to see a lot of this repeated and the ones that repeat are the most important. So routine, 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 exercise, 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 routine, 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 exercise, exercise, exercise. We're going to pause there for just a second because I want to explain something. Sleep is a learned behavior. So just as we have to learn to crawl, we have to learn to walk, we have to learn to run, we have to learn to add 2 plus 2, we have to learn to write an essay, we have to learn to sleep. We're actually not born knowing how to do it. And so it's really important that we learn it. And the way we learn it is routine. But exercise is extremely important as well because we know that we need exercise to sleep better. Other tips, avoid caffeine after noon. A lot of people don't know that the half-life of caffeine is between 6 and 8 hours. What does that mean in real time? What that means is if you drink a cup of coffee at 12 noon, half of that caffeine is still going to be in your body at 6 p.m. that night. And so if you think about that, when children come home from school, if they're checking a Dr. Pepper or a Coke or getting something from Starbucks, half of that caffeine is still in their body at 9 p.m., keeping them awake. Avoid blue light a couple hours before bed. You all have heard this, I'm sure, but we have these sensors in the backs of our brains. They're super crazy. They're in our eyes. And when they see light, the wavelength of blue light, which is the light that comes out of the cell phone or the computer or the TV, it actually tells our brain not to produce our natural melatonin and to produce hormones that wake us up. So avoiding the blue light right before bed makes a big difference. Using the bedroom for sleep only. And this is often very tough for teenagers. Teenagers love their bedrooms. They love to burrow in. And so what I will say, if you have a teenager who really is just very attached to their bedroom, we recommend using the bed for sleep only. And so if you need to put up little curtains around the bed, so it's a dedicated sleep spot, if you need to get them a beanbag chair or something like that. But for the younger ones, what we did at our house, we had a fairly small house, my children are little, and we would put the toys in boxes, pull them out to the living room. And that's where we would play. And then we could put it back in the boxes to clean up. So the bedroom was used for sleep only. And then no devices in the bedrooms. We do know that children and adolescents who have a TV or a cell phone or a computer in their bedroom, they actually sleep 30 minutes less than children who don't have a TV, cell phone, or computer in the bedroom. The one other thing that's not on here is have a bedtime. We know that children and adolescents who don't have a bedtime also sleep 30 minutes less than children who do. And again, part of that is just the routine, getting your body on that routine of going to sleep at night. And these are strategies for optimizing sleep. And you're going to see some of these a lot too. I call these the 3 Bs. So you're going to brush teeth, you're going to read a book, you're going to get in bed. And it's easy to remember because it's 3 Bs. And when children are little, they love a good picture chart. And so printing out something like this and putting it on the wall and letting the children know what they're doing and having these visual cues can make a big difference for the preschoolers. But again, this routine is training your child to sleep. Elementary school, what do? Guess what? It's the same thing. Brush teeth, read a book, get in bed. Brush teeth, read a book, get in bed. And what you're doing is you're separating bed from screen time, from playtime, from card games, from all the things that are really fun. Not that reading's not fun, I love reading, but you're separating it for a really calm activity for the best part. In high school, this can shift a little bit. Some children really hate reading. They can sub music or meditation or an audiobook. They don't need to be looking at their phone to get the audiobook or to get the meditation. But again, brush teeth, downtime, get in bed. It's the same for adults. So you guys can see this right here. You've got brushing teeth, reading a book, getting in bed, and that's really important. But there have to be more strategies, right? Because routine's so last year, and I just want my kids to be flexible. So I hear this all the time. I just want my kids to be flexible. And the truth is, to make your children flexible and resilient, the best thing you can do is actually protect their sleep schedule. As crazy as it sounds, the more you protect it, the more flexible they actually will be on nights that they can't get the full amount of sleep in. But let's talk through some of these. Set a bedtime. We talked about this. Children with a bedtime sleep better. Exercise. So even 30 minutes of exercise makes a world of difference in sleep. all children sleep better with exercise. Devices out of the bedroom. We talked about this. We're gonna skip managed stress for a second and then do avoid caffeine. Talked about this. The half-life of caffeine is 6 to 8 hours. If they are drinking that caffeinated drink in the afternoons, then they are not gonna go to sleep at night, and that's really important. But let's talk about managing stress for a second. So while sleep is definitely really great tool in managing stress, sometimes the stress is so much that children can't sleep. All right. And there are various strategies that you can use as a family to manage stress. So one might be that at the dinner table, you actually go around and you can do your high and low. High would be the best thing about the day, the low would be the worst thing about the day. Sometimes just that alone allows the child to talk about what stressed them out. And as a parent, you can reassure them and make them feel better for the night. Sometimes children are so stressed out that they really can't go to sleep and they get themselves worked up. A couple different options for that. One of my favorites is the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 method. And what that is, those children, you ask them to name 5 things that they can see, and they name them out loud. 4 things that they can feel or touch, right? 3 things that they can hear, 2 things that they can smell, and 1 thing that they can taste. And when you do that, you're tapping into your child's senses. And what that does is that brings them out of the fight, flight, or freeze stress and into their calm, rational mind. And once they're in that calm, rational mind, what you can do is then take them through, let's brush teeth, let's read a book, let's get in bed. We're going to handle this tomorrow. It doesn't always work, but it often does. And I will use this during the day when a child is stressed out. I will use this in clinic when a child is stressed out. I've used it myself before a presentation when I was really nervous, when I used to get really nervous with these. And so I think it's really important to know managing stress is important. If the stress is more than you can manage, then that's when you would want to seek professional help. So another strategy, beds are for sleep only. And so I put this dorm room up because if you'll notice, even though the bed is high, right, what you see is there's actually a desk. Okay, so dorm, you can only live, you got to live and breathe and do everything in the same room. You don't have an option of using the bedroom for sleep only. So this goes back to using the bed for sleep only. You can see that there's a sofa for sitting and hanging out. There is a desk for doing homework, and the bed itself is just for sleep. You can't access anything else, just sleep. And so I think that's important to know. So what's a typical sleep problem? Well, I love this quote. People who say they sleep like a baby usually don't have one, right? Because everybody remember when their children were newborns, right? That babies do not sleep, right? At least not initially. They have a lot of crying in there. But let's talk about it. And we're going to talk about some sleep challenges through the ages, okay? So a little bit of baby and infant sleep problems, really more preschool, and then some preschool problems. And, you don't probably want your child sleeping on the dog bed. That is my child after having to go to a visitation during nap time. He passed out on the dog bed afterwards. And then there's the teenager problem of you get your teenagers up too early and you turn around and they're like flat on the ground, sound asleep. And it doesn't matter that there's a beautiful background behind them because they just wanted to sleep. So when we think about preschool problems, and that's really what we're going to focus more on because that's more germane to this talk, we think about bedtime delays, separation anxiety, nightmares, and night terrors, which are a little bit different in co-sleeping. For those of you who don't know Mo Willems, even if you have teenagers, please go to the library and read some Mo Willems. This book is Don't Let the Pigeons Stay Up Late. So this is your, I need another glass of water. I need another hug. I forgot to tell you. And those are your bedtime delays. You do see some separation anxiety in preschoolers. I'm scared. I need you to be with me. Nightmares are a little bit different from night terrors. So nightmares, children actually remember, and there's a process of working through those, but it keeps them from going back to sleep. Whereas night terrors occur while the child is sleeping. They really aren't very disturbing to the children, but they're incredibly disturbing to the parents. And then we also see a lot of, I can't get my child out of my bed at this age. And while it doesn't probably disrupt her preschooler sleep, it is terrible for the adult sleep. When we think about elementary school, and this is so true, right? Tommy can't play now, but he might be able to squeeze you in between soccer and his piano lesson. You all know our children are overscheduled, my children are overscheduled, right? We are overscheduled as adults. But what we know is in elementary school, we start to see sports becoming a problem with these late night practices of 8 or 9 o'clock at night. We start to see more and more homework keeping children up. We do see nightmares still in elementary school children. We often start to see sleepwalking in elementary school children, which occurs really primarily because children are sleep deprived, interestingly enough, although there is a genetic component. We do know that naps are abnormal at this age, again, and so if you have a child who's napping at this age, we would ask that you talk to your pediatrician about it. And then this is also when devices come into play. So whether it's computer driven homework or children looking at playing video games or hopping on a device to distract them, devices start to impact sleep at this time too. High school. And this is something I'm really passionate about. So we know that developmentally, teenagers cannot get to sleep before 11 p.m. and cannot wake up before about 8:30 a.m. It doesn't mean they can't get up and get out of bed, but it does mean that they are not fully awake. And so what does that mean? That means that their circadian rhythm, the internal clock that tells them when to go to sleep and when to wake up, is set at being a night owl. And that's almost universal for teenagers. All right. Whereas the elderly are almost always morning larks, not always, but almost always. But when you look at the circadian rhythm, where children really can't be awake fully before 8:30 a.m., and we look at a lot of our school start times, we see that children are having to get to school sometimes as early as 7:30 or 8 o'clock in the morning. And when that happens, they're not fully awake, and yet they're supposed to be awake to try and learn and retain information and make good decisions. And they're sleep deprived, right? Because they haven't been able to go to sleep until after 11. And so if we think about that, we call that the perfect storm. Here are these adolescents who need, at the top of the bell curve, 9 hours and 15 minutes of sleep a night. And they are unable to get it because physiologically they can't go to sleep before 11, but school starts so early that they really have to be up and at 'em. Usually often with only 7.5 hours of sleep. What else do we see during high school? And this is a great parody. If you haven't read this Goodnight iPad written by Anne Floyd. It really is very funny. So blue light is a huge issue. Children go to bed, they're sleeping with their phone, the text is going off all night, they're looking at it, they're trying to play music. We also see that they start hitting their snooze button more frequently, and that really just ends up disrupting their last REM period more than anything. Caffeine becomes a big player. This is when we actually start to see caffeine in schools, often in middle school and at the high school. We will see caffeine being offered in schools, but then also they are more mobile. They're stopping for their after school coffee. Sports tend to start having 2-a-day practices, which interestingly really have no impact on sports performance. And in fact, we know that motor tasks are learned in an afternoon sports practice followed by sleep, and the morning practice offers no benefit. But for whatever reason, that hasn't caught on in the sports world. We know that children start sleeping in. Well, what does that do? That jet lags their body for the weekend, right? So every weekend, if they sleep in 4 or 5 hours compared to the week, that's like they flew across the country and back for the weekend. It's really hard. We also start to see sleep paralysis at this age, if they're going to have it. It's not super common, but it tends to be Googled a lot. And it is when they are waking up, but they can't move their body, or when they're falling asleep and they can't move their body. It often is resolved if we can just get them enough sleep. And then we also start to see the disorders of hypersomnia. What does that mean? That means sleeping too much. So narcolepsy is actually a disease of adolescence. It tends to present in the teenage years, sometimes in the 20s, but usually in the teenage years. It can present earlier. It's important to note if your child is sleeping through fun things, right? So if they're at a basketball game and they're asleep, or they are sleeping through a trip or a concert, they're falling asleep at Taylor Swift, for example, your child probably has a hypersomnia problem and you need to see your doctor. Most of the hypersomnia we see is from not enough sleep. Right? It's called insufficient sleep syndrome, and it's really common. However, if your child is getting enough sleep and falling asleep in weird places, this is a good time to see your doctor. And again, this is very common in high school. So can I get a little help, right? We've talked about all these problems. Is there a way to help? And I love this Irish proverb, a good laugh and a long sleep are the best cures in the doctor's book. And I can't tell you how much sleep impacts, whether it is your child's ability to fight infection, to prevent injury, to make good decisions. Sleep really does change everything. So let's talk a little bit about that. And what we're going to talk about this from is from the community standpoint, right? There are a lot of individual sleep changes that we can make and a lot of individual things we can do. But if we talk about sleep as a community, it really is much more powerful. And so let's talk about what can be done as a community to impact sleep. Number one, school nurse intervention. Y'all, there's been a study that shows that if the school nurse at any age talks to the children at the beginning of the school year about the importance of sleep and how to get good sleep, so turning off the devices, the caffeine, creating the routine, those children sleep more for the next 6 months than they did with the children who didn't get the intervention, right? And so just that simple intervention, that's a really easy intervention, is have the school nurse talk to each class at the beginning of the school year. Protect playground time. So exercise, again, is so important. And a lot of times playground time falls off, right? Or it's used as punishment for impulsivity or other behavior. Honestly, protecting the playground time probably will make sleep better, but it will also make the impulsivity better. Exercise makes it all better. So in protecting that playground time is really important. So playground time cannot be used as a punishment. There could be something else found. Or even if it's a rainy day, there's a way to get some activity done. It's really important for sleep. No soda in the lunchroom. This is super easy because if there's not access to it, a lot of children won't go get it, right? And so sure, they can go pay for it with their own money at the CVS down the street, or they can bring it from home. But a lot of children, if they don't have access to it in the lunchroom, they just won't drink the soda or the coffee or any of that. So just keeping caffeine out of the lunchroom makes a difference. Decrease nightly homework. And this always kind of makes teachers go, what? But most teachers know that homework actually doesn't impact learning. And so if you have a child who's staying up super late to do homework, they're probably not able to absorb the information the next day. And that's really important to know. So as much as you can decrease nightly homework, it will help sleep. And then no really late or early morning practices. Honestly, the teenagers, the adolescents should be the ones practicing later at night. They're less likely to be injured then. And the little ones are the ones who really need to be practicing earlier in the day. So some of that involves navigating gym time, navigating work schedules. And I know that's hard, especially when you have parent coaches, but it's really important to try and get, especially the elementary school children home. I would say no later than 8 p.m. So an 8 p.m. practice would be too late for an elementary school child. And I think that's important for the community to recognize and work on. Let's talk about these a little bit more. So the nurse intervention only. So 17% of the children had fewer sleep problems. That's a big percentage. That's almost 1 in 5. They had better sleep patterns. They had longer sleep duration. Interestingly, the parents also reported fewer symptoms of depression in the children who had the sleep intervention. Also, interestingly, they had improvement at the 6-month mark, but not the 12-month mark, which suggests that our children need to hear this repeatedly. They need repeated information about sleep. When we talk about homework, and these are just some really in particular things I wanted to point out. Children with homework 5 nights a week sleep on average 30 minutes less than their peers with homework 0 to 2 nights per week. That 30 minutes, if you think about that at the end of the week, that's 2.5 hours. That's a pretty big block of sleep they're missing. Teens with homework resulting in less than 7 hours of sleep have increased anxiety, depression, and neurological problems. So headaches, they can have an increase in seizures, things like that. I think it's really important to note girls tend to be more impacted than boys. We don't know why, but they do. And so studies do show, though, that homework and sleep really do go hand in hand. Practices in gym time. Again, the younger kids need to practice as early as possible. 2-a-day practices really don't help. And I would say the same applies to musical theater, band, or any extracurricular. When I was at Children's of Alabama, I would frequently see children in the spring who were falling asleep in class, and I'd say, tell me about your activities. And they would be in musical theater and they'd be doing the set and practicing until 11 o'clock at night sometimes, and then trying to get homework done. So again, it is all extracurriculars and still protect physical activity at all costs. I really cannot stress how important that is for children to sleep, because it impacts not only their sleep, but also their stress about sleep and also their well-being. Nutrition. So we can do this in our lunchrooms, right? Can we have a little bit more high protein, more complex carbs, lower refined sugar, and minimal caffeine? This makes a huge difference in terms of sleep. The sugar can cause you to have a high peak and then a crash. And so if you can add complex carbs to protein, that's going to keep children more full for a little bit longer. We know that if children wake up hungry at night, if you can give them a complex carbohydrate with a protein, it'll help. So a banana with some peanut butter, or an apple with some cheese. Those sorts of things can make a big difference in your sleep. But let's talk about this. And this is a really important thing. I'm very passionate about this, and it's a busy slide. But this came out from the American Academy of Pediatrics, and I'm going to summarize it. So teens in the United States are chronically sleep deprived. Yet physiologically, they cannot go to sleep routinely before 11 p.m. and cannot wake routinely before 8 a.m. Sleep deprivation negatively impacts learning, mood, behavior, safety, and health. At junior high and high school should not start before 8:30 a.m. We're going to talk a little bit about the evidence behind this. I will say that we know that only 10% of adolescents in the United States currently get enough sleep. That's a really sad statistic, because we are setting our children up for failure if we're not able to protect their sleep and leverage it. So let's look at this. Let's look at the school start times. We know that children who sleep at least 8 hours, it's right at 50% if school starts at 8 a.m. If it starts at 8:35 a.m., it's 60%. And if it starts at almost 9 a.m., it's 66.2%. That's a big jump in sleep. Okay. And we know that sleep deprivation can build on itself. And so what will happen is you miss 2.5 hours this week, and then you miss 2.5 hours next week, and then you miss 2.5 hours next week. By the end of the month, you've missed an entire night of sleep. So being able to get our children enough sleep, again, our goal is 9 hours, but this is looking at the 8-hour mark on the study. This slide, you don't have to worry about the nitty gritty, but basically there were depression inventory scores given to a group of children who, it was thousands of adolescents in a school district that delayed school start times. And their depression scores went down, which is good. That's what you want. You don't want them to be more depressed. But 92% of parents actually wrote in, my child is easier to live with, right? Or some variation of that. 92% of parents said that just by delaying school start time. That's really significant. Upgrades. And this is a really interesting slide to me. And this is why 8:30 has been picked as the time by the American Academy of Pediatrics. Really, the most benefit is shown for grades if you start at 8:30 a.m. or later. The grades in between really weren't super statistically different. And there are some question as to whether or not some of the schools, the early start times were related to children who were getting up. There were more higher achievers who had other stuff going on, and so they wanted to do that early period. But consistently at the 8:30 school start time, grades improved significantly. You can see this is over 7,000 children. This is so important, I don't even know where to start. Motor vehicle crashes. I've just given you 3 examples. There are a lot of examples. So these are examples of when there was a change in school start time, what happened to motor vehicle crashes in the 17 to 18-year-olds, okay, during the school week. All right, so think about that. We're not talking about all children. We're talking about 17 and 18-year-olds. And in Kentucky, a district changed to an 8:30 start time from a 7:30 start time, and their car crashes went down by 16.5%. In Minnesota, there was a 70-minute change with an 8:40 a.m. start time. Their car crashes went down 65%. And in Wyoming, where the children have the longest distance to drive, they had an 80-minute change, and that started at 8:55 a.m. And their car crashes and their teenagers went down by 70% during the week. 70%, y'all. Think about how much safer it is. And I've shown this slide before and had people argue, yes, but they changed the school start time. How do you know? They should just get used to getting up earlier. Well, let me show this. There were 2 counties in Virginia that were compared, right? Virginia Beach County started between 7:20, 7:25 a.m. Chesapeake started between 8:40, 8:45 a.m. They didn't change the school start time, but you can see that the crash rates were really different. Okay, and these are crash rates for teens. If you look right here, that's a difference of 27.2%. Okay, if you look here for all other ages, when you exclude the other ones, it's 4.3% difference. It makes a difference. So the children who went to school at 8:40 to 8:45 a.m. were much less likely to get in a car accident than the children from Virginia Beach. This shows us that it's not just about changing school start time and, oh, they can get used to the earlier time. It actually is a physiologic problem. But what else? What else do we see? Well, this looked at a group of schools, a lot of different studies, and it's a busy slide, okay? But what I'm gonna do is break it down. In schools that delayed their school start time, weekly caffeine use went down by 1.73 drinks per week. Falling asleep in class in one study went down by 24.6%. Falling asleep in class in another study went down by 17%. Being too tired to do their schoolwork went down by 23.8%. Tardies went down by 9%. Tardies went down by 14.1%. Being late to class for oversleeping went down 36%. Being too tired to do schoolwork, well, that went down 23.8%. Being too tired for schoolwork in another school district went down by 15%. Fatigue health center visits went down by 10.7%. That's a whole lot of problems that can be solved just by getting a little bit more sleep. So in essence, what I'd like to say is that sleep really matters. It matters for health. It matters for learning. It matters for socialization. It matters for safety. It matters for sports. But maybe more importantly, as we think about building resilient children and children of character, it matters for empathy, for attitude, for motivation, for friendship, and for citizenship. If your child needs help, we are available. So we have both an Instagram account and a Facebook account where you can read fun statistics about sleep. Right now, we're doing a sports and sleep series, but you can read fun information about sleep there. But if you actually need one-on-one help, you can go to our homepage. You can schedule an appointment to be seen. If you have a newborn baby or have someone expecting a newborn baby, we have a seminar that's available monthly where people can come and they can learn how to prevent problems. And then we've got, like I said, a newsletter that we can send out to you as well. And it comes out once a month with sleep tips. So thank you very much for listening and for inviting me. And may you all sleep better and have sleep dreams.
Are you good to take some
Sure.
questions?
Sure.
If we have any here
Absolutely.
or if we have any online? Carrie, can you see if people could drop a question in the chat? And maybe you could read it out for us.
Yes, so far there's not any, but if anybody online, if you have a question, want to know more, just drop it in the chat. We'll wait just a minute and see.
I had a question, sorry, and
Yes.
I haven't ever even asked this of you, and I see you a decent amount. So this really hit home with me is the ADHD diagnosis and potential for ADHD overdiagnosis due to just the fact that it includes hyperactivity. So my thought when you were talking about that was, okay, so we're potentially diagnosing children with ADHD when we shouldn't be, but then we give them stimulants, right? How do the stimulants then affect their ability to sleep?
Okay, so the question is, if we are diagnosing someone with ADHD and giving them a stimulant when really they need sleep, how do the stimulants impact sleep? And I probably should have had this disclaimer at the beginning before I answer that. This is all meant to be very informative. It is not meant to be a substitute for a doctor. So if you do have specific questions for your child, we would want you to see your doctor. But for that question in particular, what we know is the stimulants have a sort of varying time that they last in each child. So there are children that get stimulants and then they can't go to sleep. There are other children who we're really just sort of amping them up, kind of a la Michael Jackson. And they can either crash but not get great quality sleep or not go to sleep at night. And so it just depends on how long it takes the child to have the stimulant work through their body. It certainly impacts naps though.
Who can't sleep, like regardless, I think it's a not shutting their brain down. Melatonin is, I have a kid who we give merely, he's a teenager, 1 milligram. I swear that didn't sound right. Like, I'm like, really, that makes a difference? But like, how do you do when literally if you don't take that, and I think it is a mind thing too, but his brain constantly works. So how do you navigate that?
Okay, so this question's about melatonin and your brain constantly racing. And so first I will say melatonin is not FDA regulated or approved. So I think that's important to know. So when you get melatonin off the counter, you actually have no idea what you're getting. So if we pull 10 bottles of the same brand, same lot number, there is no quality control. And so they all are going to have different doses in it. So that's part of it. And it's a hormone. So what I will say is certainly in a pre-pubertal child, you want to be really cautious. We also know that to your point about a little whiff, right? Their receptors are saturated at 1 milligram. And there is a time to use melatonin. So I want to be really clear, there is a time to use it. Typically in teenagers with what's called delayed sleep phase, but there is a time to use it. In terms of turning the brain off though, that's where reading or audiobooks actually can be really helpful. And so telling your child, you don't actually have to go to sleep, but you do have to go read. Okay. And giving them something, or you can, if they're older, I have a handful of patients that will color. And that helps them turn their brain off. But also if they're worriers, then you set a time to worry that earlier that day. And they actually have a dedicated worry time. And then they can write their worries down, tear them up. They can go through the whole process, get rid of them. And then at night, when their mind starts going, they actually can tell themselves, oh, this is not my worry time. This is my reading time. And so a lot of the turning the brain off is actually related to being able to distract the brain a little bit. The other thing that helps with that though is exercise. So
I get plenty of that. It's just a sleep thing.
Yeah.
But it's like he's a teenager.
Yes.
This has been from birth to now.
Yes, and it's hard. And there are underlying reasons that some children do have more brain racing than others. And so in those children, you kind of have to sort of delve deep into that. Is it worry? Is it planning for the future? Is it, I'm really working through what it's racing about.
Okay.
That actually can make a big difference too. But audiobooks is my child who has mind racing. Audiobooks have made a huge difference.
Did they make them drift off to sleep? Because mine gets excited about the story.
So you can listen to a book that you've listened to 100 times before.
Right.
Read a book that you read. So one of mine loves Harry Potter. And so there are times that I will, kind of gotten up to go in the middle of the night for something. I'll hear something and I'll hear, hey Alexa, play Harry Potter #4, Goblet of Fire, chapter 4. And then 5 minutes later, I'll go check on me sound asleep. So it's more just that it's enough to distract him. Now, the first time he read Harry Potter, I'm going to put it down.
Right. Okay.
Right. And that's just an example of the book.
Gotcha.
But that works across the board. So that works for adults too.
Okay.
So, as we hit our 40s, we all start to have a little bit of mind racing at night. And I will tell you, I read before bed.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, we do have one question online, and it said, any advice for 2 different households because the parents are divorced, but they do not agree on the bedtime routine. So the child has 2 different routines going on. Any suggestions or advice there?
So that's really, really hard, to be perfectly honest. That's a really hard situation. And as the child gets older, the goal would be that they would be able to take charge of their own bedtime routine. I don't know how old this is, but I'm assuming a little bit younger. I would say that when So I'm a single mom. I will say that children do learn, these are the rules for this house, these are the rules for that house. Now, does that mean that if one parent allows them to stay up all night watching TV, that you can fix that? Probably not. Does that mean that they're gonna come home and they're like, come back to your house exhausted? Probably so. And they still know at your house, these are the rules, and you can only control that than when you're at your house, if you guys can't get on the same page. And so I think really just having this consistent rules for your house will make a difference. But yeah, some of it you can't control, and that's really, really hard.
Just wondering if you could speak on phototherapy. I've had, different pediatricians talk about, just the importance of getting outside and exposing yourself to the natural light or even opening windows. And that kind of starts your natural circadian rhythm, that if you do that later, obviously that it starts later. And then the same thing, they've also told me that if you're, exposed to like the sun coming down, just being outside or watching, but just the simple act of, being in that, also it signals to your body, hey, it's time to kind of start. But
Yeah,
what are your thoughts on like phototherapy?
phototherapy.
And I've heard of people actually getting light boxes and, things like that, with seasonal affective disorder, when you don't have as much natural light, or it's, later and everything, and that kind of being a treatment. But how does that affect sleep, and what are your recommendations?
So the question is, how does phototherapy or exposure to light impact sleep? And I would say that if you are on a relatively sort of standard sleep schedule, meaning you tend to fall asleep at night, you tend to get up in the mornings, then morning light exposure is important for sort of cinching that circadian rhythm, right? We all have an internal clock. It tells us when to fall asleep and when to wake up, right? So that's really important. Being outside as the sun comes down may or may not impact your sleep from a evidence perspective, right? But being outside in the morning and being exposed to sleep. So we'll say, get up, you want to open your curtains, you want to turn on, step outside, if you can go have your coffee outside, all of those things are really important. In terms of actually buying the light, all right, light therapy requires specific timing. So to do it properly, you have to wear something called an actigraphy watch, which is this sort of expensive accelerometer that measures movement. And as it does that, you then document when your body's natural falling asleep period is, natural waking up period is, and you actually time that with, there's like a whole formula. I'm always hesitant to tell people to do phototherapy unless they've seen a sleep doctor who can actually map out when they need to do it, because sometimes, like if you have a teenager who really can't wake up before like 1 p.m. and you're trying to put light on them at 8 a.m., for example, that actually can make it worse. So phototherapy can be incredibly beneficial, and I definitely use it in prevention of jet lag, and I use it with delayed sleep phase and certain really specific sleep disorders, but I don't recommend it from a like light standpoint. But seasonal affective disorder is a whole nother ballgame, and that's, I think it's certainly recommended in that, but I don't have the latest evidence.
Well, and I think, that was more addressed for like summer schedule where you're not on that, get up at this time, go to school, you've got all these regular activities. It's just a little, or kids going off to college. And we all know that, they're all surprised because, oh, I don't have to be at class from 8 to 3 and, and kind of figuring that part out. But, my other thought was, we've got daylight savings coming up. I mean, like what are your recommendations in those transitions twice a year where we have to kind of, make adjustments? Yeah.
So it's always easier to fall back.
Right.
Always easier to fall back. I love falling back because it gives you that extra hour of sleep. I hate springing forward. In terms of springing forward, you can slowly adjust for the 2 weeks ahead of time, sort of in 15-minute increments, right? You can start shifting yourself for both schedules, or shifting your child a little bit in 15-minute increments for about 2 weeks before it starts, to make it a little easier on your body. But it's not ideal. Studies show that there are far more car accidents after you spring forward. right? And that's related probably to sleep deprivation and your mind not being alert. I did want to bring up one thing you said. You mentioned college kids. So interestingly, college kids sleep more than high school kids. And it probably is because they're not in 7 hours of class every day. They have more time for homework and they have more sort of autonomy on their schedule. And most of the time now, colleges have gotten wise to it. There are not as many 8 a.m.s as there were when I went through college. And so they can actually go to sleep. Interestingly, the other thing that's really interesting is, and I didn't have a slide in there about this, but there was a big argument that if you let them go to school later, they'll just stay up later, right? And a Virginia school district changed their school start times and looked at that. Children went to bed 15 minutes earlier with the later school start time. And they think it's because they went from having 20% of kids falling asleep in school, 25% of kids falling asleep during homework, to not falling asleep in school, not falling asleep in homework. And instead of going to bed later, they went to bed earlier. And so that biological drive to sleep is really strong. And really and truly for most teenagers, it's 11 p.m. And it's just that happens. Yeah.
Are there other questions? Because I don't want to.
Are there questions online right now?
Nope, that's it.
You're good. Keep going.
Well, I mean, I think we're all here and we all buy into the idea of, our teenagers especially need more sleep, that it would benefit them and society as a whole, probably if we could accommodate those biological factors. I don't know how we go about trying to affect that kind of accommodation because it certainly affects, work.
It does.
And, all these other things. And also if they're starting a little bit later, all the extracurriculars go a little bit later, which goes more into dinner time, and all those things. I went to, I grew up in Maryland. I went to magnet schools. And I think because of all the different busing, my high school actually didn't start till 9:30, but that meant we weren't done till 4. And that meant that all the extracurriculars, all the games, all those things, so truly, while my school start time was much later, everything else also kind of was much later. And often I wouldn't get home to even start my homework and things like that till like 8 o'clock sometime, depending on what was going on. So it's kind of like hard to address all the things. And I think 9:30 is kind of late. I think that was because of, like I said, the busing, and I grew up in just outside of DC metro area. So it's just a lot of,
So I think if you really look at that logistically, first of all, it tends to happen more in communities where parents have a little bit more flexibility and where there are more drivers. It just does. And I think that needs to be said. So Homewood would be one of those communities for sure, right?
except we don't have busing. And I do wonder how that schedule would affect parents and their work schedules. If the high schools, even if it started at 8:30, and a half hour later.
One thought that I have had in the past is we do know that if we could, even if it was had to be dropped off a little earlier, if the academic classes didn't start till 8:30, that's when their brain's awake, right? They may have to be dropped off at 8, maybe you need busing, maybe you need carpools, maybe every county that has done this or every school district that has done this has had a little bit different way of handling it. Some have had buses, some haven't. Some have had parents that have banded together and said, we're going to make it work. We're going to, we're in a close enough community that we can carpool and make it work. We've got seniors who can drive younger kids kind of thing, right? And so I think that that's important to note. I do think 9:30 is late, but I will also say, there's not a huge difference if your child gets out at 3 versus 3:30 for most things. And if you think about it, all the sports stuff doesn't start till 7 p.m. anyway, right? So when do your basketball games start? When do your football games start? When do your softball games start, right? They're not starting generally right after school. There's still a gap. And so it shortens that gap a little bit, but it doesn't really change what time they start. Does that make sense? So even going to school at 7:45 in the morning or 7:30 in the morning, you're still at the mercy of the basketball the court schedule, right? Or the softball field schedule or or what have you. And so it doesn't change that as much. It changes a little bit the evening practices. But the other thing I found is teenagers get home way earlier than elementary school kids because the elementary school kids are actually being coached by parents a lot of the time. And so they're not starting till afterwards. So in high schools, when they delay the high school, oftentimes they're able to then get those children in for an earlier practice, or everybody's kind of home more at the same time, right? I mean, I was talking to a friend who's got got 3 children in the Vestavia school system. One is still in elementary school. And she said, we have a full dinner with my older 2 because they get home from football practice. And then we have to go get him from whatever activity he's in. And then we have to have a whole other dinner with him. And I think that's important to note too, because I do think that that's backwards. But it doesn't impact the schools, the high schools as much for after school as it does the young, the younger ones. So they're all good questions though.
So I have a question about this idiopathic hypersomnia, because I feel like I've encountered more young people with this, like college age and high school age. Is this caused by our lifestyle? I mean, what?
So the question is, what is causing all the idiopathic hypersomnia? What does that even mean? Idiopathic just means we don't know why you have this, and hypersomnia means you're sleeping too much. The truth is, most of it's actually caused by insufficient sleep, but people are very reluctant to put that because then people are like, well, just sleep more. And you're like, well, that's not possible with my schedule. Narcolepsy is a disorder of REM sleep. So it's a disorder where you actually fall asleep in under 8 minutes in a series of 5 naps that are given at 2-hour intervals. And once you fall asleep, you actually go into REM sleep in that nap period. Idiopathic hypersomnia, you just don't go into the REM sleep during 2 naps. And that's really the only big difference. We do know though that the incidence of certain things have gone up since COVID, right? So POTS, for example, and we know that there's an increased risk of hypersomnia in the children who have POTS. So it may be that there are things that play a role to change sort of the epigenetics of stuff and the genetics of stuff as our world changes. But we know that most of the children who present with hypersomnia have insufficient sleep. And then after that, narcolepsy is actually a much bigger risk. But also, I would say that sometimes if you see a pediatric sleep doctor, they're generally very comfortable with the diagnosis of narcolepsy because we diagnose it all the time. Adult sleep doctors are sometimes a little more hesitant to diagnose it in a child because they're like, am I labeling you? The truth is they need, if they have it, they need to be diagnosed from a medication standpoint so we can treat them. And you can go on to live a really happy, healthy life. So I think Jimmy Kimmel has narcolepsy. Harriet Tubman had head injury-induced narcolepsy. Anyway, there's somebody else. I can see his face, and I can't think of his name right now, from England, who had narcolepsy. Winston Churchill had narcolepsy.
Medication for narcolepsy.
So you can't cure narcolepsy, but you can treat narcolepsy. And so there are multiple medications on the market, and different ones treat different aspects of it. And so it's a very, not for everybody. There are a handful of people who really are just very resistant to treatment. But we treat a lot of children with narcolepsy. And adolescents especially. My rule was, if you're going to be on medication to drive. And then we make them do a test where they have to actually stay awake for 40 minutes for 4 different time slots during the day on medicine to prove that they can do that.
Oh.
Yeah, so it's a lot more common than you would think. It's about 1 in 2,000 in the United States. It is about 1 in 500 in parts of Japan. And then interestingly, the population that we think of as having all the problems. So in medicine, you always hear people who have an Ashkenazi Jew background have more illnesses. It's actually only 1 in 5,000 in that population. So you just sort of never know, but it's genetic. And so you have it, you're predisposed to it, like you might be predisposed to type 1 diabetes. And then there's something, and then you have what we call an environmental hit. So it could be the stomach bug, it could be a major stressor, whatever that sort of tips that gene, turns that gene on or off. Yeah. That's way on the skip of this talk. That's more just a.
Someone was raising their hand.
Yes, there's a question.
Carrie, is there a question? We saw a hand raised earlier.
I'm looking.
Oh, okay, sorry. Don't mean to rush you.
I'm clicking around. I don't see one. There's nothing in the Q&A.
Maybe I answered it.
One more.
Yeah, of course.
So when you said the teenagers needed more sleep than 9 hours, does that count like if they get 7 hours sleep and then they need a 2 hour nap after school?
Yeah.
Or is it 9 straight hours that they need?
So the question is, do teenagers need 9 straight hours of sleep, or can they do a 2 hour nap after school and a 7 hour nap? The truth is, ideally, they get the 9 hours and 15 minutes consecutively. But as a mom who has teenagers, if my child say takes a 2 hour nap in the afternoon and then sleeps 7 hours, I'm probably not gonna freak out about that, right? Do I want her to do that? No. Would I rather her do that than just sleep 7 hours? 100%. So I think the big thing is I would never give my child car keys if they were sleeping, because it's the equivalent of giving your child car keys if they're drunk. And I think that's really important. And so my kids kind of know going into driving, and I don't have, I mean, my oldest is 15, but they know going into driving, like you will never be allowed to drive a car if you are not on a good sleep schedule. Because that is so scary to me. I'm like, you're already gonna be a teenager without a fully developed frontal lobe.
Right.
And I didn't show this slide. There's some really fabulous studies that do PET scans that look at your brain's activity. And what they show is in 20-year-olds, right, plus or minus a couple of years. If you take them and they've slept really well, and you take them and you do a PET scan and you show them negative images, their frontal lobe lights up. So your frontal lobe is your thing that keeps you from dancing naked in the street, right? It's your decision-making brain. If they sleep deprive those 20-year-olds and show them negative images, their amygdala lights up, but their frontal lobe connection is severed. And what that means is they're functioning all from fight, flight, or freeze. And so it really is important. I mean, it's the physiology, this is way out of the scope of this, but the physiology behind it is fascinating when you look at what sleep deprivation does to the brain. So, I mean, you basically go from having a semi-adult, right, to a toddler.
Compare that to adults not getting enough sleep.
So very similar. Very similar, right? It actually is very similar. So we know that adults who don't get enough sleep have an increased risk of high blood pressure, they have an increased risk of stroke, they have an increased risk of weight gain, which is, I think, can be really important. They have way more inflammation in their bodies. So you think of like things like autoimmune disease or arthritis, things like that. And if you're not getting enough sleep, that inflammation is going to be worse. They have worse outcomes when it comes to illness. So if you're sick and you don't have a robust sleep response, you're not going to get well as fast. It's related to injury in adults, and then it certainly is related to car accidents in adults. So although we do know that about 50% of the fall asleep at the wheel crashes occur in under 25 years of age. So I think that's important. Yeah.
How many hours an adult requires?
How many hours does an adult require? Such a good question. So it's again a bell curve, right? So we would say 7 to 9 for most adults. Okay. 8 hours is what you hear because that's the top of the bell curve. 7 to 9. We don't actually, it's probably not healthy if you're sleeping a lot longer than 9 hours. It's also not healthy if you're sleeping a lot less for most people. There are a handful of people that genetically are what we call short sleepers, and they are people who really don't need as much sleep. We don't know why. They tend to die early of heart disease. So that's something that you don't necessarily want to be a short sleeper, right? But there are some. So there are people who they sleep 6 hours and they are fine. But most adults, 8 hours.
Obviously, you talked about routine and consistency. If you got teenagers or even younger kids that are just, have these really full schedules and everything, but then the weekend and you can sleep in a little bit more, or maybe they take a Sunday afternoon nap or whatever. I mean, like, you want to speak on that?
Yeah. So what about the weekend when the children are sleeping in? And what I would say is this, you still want the routine of brush teeth, read a book, get in bed before sleep, right? So before nap time, before sleep time, before anything, you want to maintain that routine. That's really important. When children sleep in, typically what I tell my children is you can sleep in for a couple hours, right? But you're still got to get up a couple hours after your normal wake time. And you still gotta go to bed a couple hours, right? I mean, there are times that they're gonna stay up later, prom, they're gonna stay up later, homecoming, they're gonna stay up later. One night probably isn't gonna destroy them, right? But for the most part, you don't wanna shift more than 2 hours for either bedtime or wake time. And y'all, there are times that your child's sick and they just need to sleep. I mean, my daughter was sick this weekend and I think she slept 18 hours in a row. Like, she didn't even get up to eat. I like went in, do you want food? She was like, no, go away. I was like, okay. Oh, you know, it's a sleep schedule. Yeah. And I was like, you just slept 18 hours. And she was like, I felt so bad. Took a stomach ache and she just felt bad, you know? And so I do think if you see your child doing that, not regularly, but occasionally, it's probably okay to let them sleep and feel better.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, she didn't have fever. Part of me was like, I'm drop kicking you to school, right? But I was like, she's not even eating and she's, you know, and for girls, they tend to sleep, but this was not her case. She's gonna die if she hears me say that. For girls, this was not her case this weekend. She really was sick, but they tend to sleep a little bit more around their periods. So if you see them sort of sleeping more, that's actually normal. It can impact that.
Okay.
And they sleep more when they're growing. You only grow when you sleep. Your growth hormone's only released when you sleep. So, there's that. But yeah, we usually say 2 hours, maybe 2.5 hours max. But probably not the sleep till noon. If they want to take a nap, one of the things with naps, and this is interesting for teenagers and for adults. So if you find that you're sleepy, and you know you've got to keep going for a little bit, right? A 20-minute nap can actually be far more effective than like a 2-hour nap. With a 20-minute nap, what it does is the way we get to sleep and stay asleep is kind of interesting. It's based on two things. One is melatonin, and that is controlled by light exposure and routine. Okay, only two things to control it. The other is something called adenosine. And so if y'all think like back to biology, you learn about ATP as energy, adenosine triphosphate. One of the things you break down with that is you end up with a byproduct called adenosine, okay? What adenosine does is it builds up in our brain over the course of the day. It's one of the reasons exercise is so important. It builds up in our brain. And then at some point, that drive to sleep becomes so much we have to go to sleep. But when we fall asleep, that adenosine empties out really quickly. Okay, so I tell people it's like in the water park when you see the big pirate bucket and it slowly fills, but then everything dumps out fast. So that happens during a power nap, right? So your adenosine has built up, right? And then once it gets to a certain point, you're just so sleepy. You sleep for 20 minutes, you dump your bucket, and you actually are more alert. And so I tell people that's really the only thing that we know helps sleep. You know, it helps you stay awake safely. So if you're driving, like gum chewing doesn't help, or sour candy, or loud music, or windows down, but sleep can help. If you're, you know, and then you have caffeine actually blocks the gates for adenosine in your brain. So that's one of the reasons you can't get to sleep with caffeine frequently. There are a handful of people who can. Most of the time, those people actually have trouble turning off their brain and have a component of ADHD, and it works as a stimulant to help them focus on sleep. And sometimes they're just overtired.
That's very good. That's good information.
Well, Dr. Maddox, this was wonderful. Thank you. Thank you all that joined us online. We appreciate y'all. We're going to make this available. It's been recorded, so we're going to be posting it on our website, and all our partners' websites around the state. So I think I might go back and listen to this one more time.
Thank you for having me.
Wonderful information. Thank you. Thank you.